Today we are covering 5 separate dexterity builds based on DLC weapons. Now I don't like to make the same build twice, so things like wing stance or a backhanded blade, great katana builds, it's not going to be on this list. I've highlighted those in some of my other build videos. So for today, just kind of cover 5 separate weapons I have yet to make a build around. All the builds I am showcasing are at level 150, and for the DLC gameplay, my Shadow Realm Blessing is at plus 16. But yes, with that out the way, let's just get into it. The Claws of Night is actually one of the better weapons to come out of this DLC, as Claws are just an amazing class due to their really quick light attacks that can output high amounts of damage. They all get passive bleed and 110 crit. Now for the Claws of Night in particular, it's not going to be the highest damaging claw as it cannot be infused, does get split magic damage which only hurts it and only has a B scaling and dexterity. It also does get the projectile heavy attacks with the running, jumping and just regular standing heavy attack, which these projectiles do not do good damage or good stance damage at all. But the reason why I'm going to value the Claws of Night still is because of its skill Scattershot Throw, which for only 11 FP does shoot out a bunch of these throwing blades that can do some very decent damage, especially when you're at closer distances. It also does get 150 bleed. Now at further distances, it's not going to do good damage at all. It still can hit very far, so it can be a way to do a little bit of chip damage at these distances. But what makes them amazing is the fact that it still gets almost just as much blood loss put up at like max range. There'll be times where you hit for about like roughly 130, 140 bleed, even if you're only hitting with like a couple of the blades of the projectile. So any single time an enemy just gets further away from you, or if you're surrounded by a bunch of enemies, you can just click the skill a couple times and probably just end up proccing bleed. Or at the very least, just stop it from decaying that much as well. So when building around the Claws of Night, obviously you want to go play around just R1 spamming and just throwing the skill. So the Shard of Alexander and the Smithing Talisman, both of these things are just going to enhance their skill damage. We're going to have Millicent's Prosthesis, which gives you +5 to Dexterity and just give you boosted damage with successive attacks. Also going to pair it alongside the Thorny Cracked tier as well. This is going to work the same way, but actually can do roughly 20% more damage. And we're going to have the Lord of Blood Exaltation alongside the White Mask, because when proccing bleed nearby an enemy, actually will get a bunch more damage. And you can also use the Sacred Bloody Flesh Consumable. This is a body buff that does roughly give you about 7% damage for the next 20 seconds. But when proccing bleed, it ends up being a 20% damage boost, which is basically the same as the Lord of Blood Exaltation Talisman, and it is going to stack with that. Now, it does involve you having to farm for these items, but there isn't really another like body buff damage alternative, as this thing is getting a lot of magic damage. Flame Gummy Strength is not going to benefit much. Now, for every build, I always recommend just speccing into a little bit of Faith, just to use some types of spells, like the damage negation spells or Bestial Vitality, which is going to be a little bit of health regen, which I'm going to use for this build because you are going to have the Blood-Sucking Cracked tier, which at our 60 vigor that we do have, it is going to drain roughly 1% HP per second, but give us 20% more damage for the next 3 minutes. So having Bestial Vitality is going to help us offset that. Now, if you notice that you're dying to this Crystal Tier a whole bunch, you can just replace this for like damage negation, like stamina regeneration. We also are going to have pieces of the Rakshasa armor set equipped, because every single piece is just 2% more damage. But as for the stats, once again, 60 vigor, I have 30 minds because you don't want to spam the skill a whole bunch, 25 endurance because it actually is somewhat expensive in terms of stamina cost, and just put the rest of the points into dexterity. The Dancing Blade of RANAH is a paired curve sword, and these power stancing curve sword movesets are probably the best in the entire game. They swing so incredibly quick, have the weapons hit simultaneously, and those running and jumping attacks just hit so many times and just output so much damage that it can just make for some of the most broken builds in the game. So just being able to upgrade one curve sword and gaining this power stancing combo is automatically just going to be really beneficial. But this weapon actually does have a really high damaging skill in Unending Dance that has a bunch of these pirouetting slashing attacks that when you hold onto the skill button, the attack persists. And when you have things like the Shard of Alexander, the multi-hit talismans like Millicent Prosthesis, and the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia alongside the Thorny Cracked tier, you can just output so much damage with this thing. If you end up getting like an opening longer than like a second or two, this thing is just going to destroy every single enemy and boss in the game. Now, it's not going to really stagger those larger enemies as well, and obviously you're not going to get hyper armor. So against a boss that does give you a shorter opening, you're not going to be able to get this attack off, but that's still not even a big deal at all because you have the best moveset in the game, so you can just use a light attacks or the jumping attacks because they are going to be quicker and just output better burst damage. But if you ever get a longer opening, you can just use the skill. Now, this skill does get boosted by the Dancer set, but I do not actually have this equipped in the gameplay because I don't really see it as that necessary, because when having the entire set equipped, it only boosts your damage by 10%. And the whole armor set is not that good in terms of damage negation. It might be good if you did want to like light roll and use like the Blue Dancer's Charm. But for me personally, I would rather just put on some heavier armor, actually get some respectable damage negation, and you can just use the Rakshasa set and this is just going to be 8% more damage to all sources. That's going to include the light attacks as well, not just the skill. Now, I'm not going to have the entire Rakshasa set equipped. I am also going to have the Gravebird's Black Quill armor. It gives you a 10% boost to your jumping attacks, which works the exact same way as the Raptor Feathers chest piece, but this one does look cooler and it gives you a bit better defenses too. You can also pair it alongside the Claw Talisman as well. But instead, for my last talisman slots, I'm going to have the Godskin Swaddling Cloth, which does give you some more health with successive attacks. And with this type of weapon, it is going to make for an amazing pairing, because as long as I'm attacking, I'm just getting a bunch of health back, and I can pair it alongside the Bestial Vitality spell, because I am going to have a little bit of faith at 15, because I am going to throw on Flame, Grant Me Strength as well for more damage and stamina recovery speed. But the main reason I have the Godskin Swaddling Cloth and Bestial Vitality is to help offset the blood-sucking cracks tier. This is 20% more damage, but I do drain roughly 1% HP per second. But as for the stats, 60 Vigor, I have 25 Mind, I do have 29 Endurance because this skill can actually consume a somewhat decent amount of stamina, and just once again put in the rest of the points into Dexterity. The hand-to-hand weapons do make for some of the most fun weapons in the entire DLC. Now, they can be on the lower end in terms of their damage output, but with the correct build, they can be extremely powerful, which is what we have right here. A Dexterity build using the DRYLEAF arts. Now, the DRYLEAF arts I am going to prefer over the Dane's Footwork if you're going to be using more heavy attacks, because this actually does get the better heavy attack, as it is quicker, does more stance damage, and that follow-up heavy attack does come out really fast, and does also just do amazing damage and amazing stance damage. And with how quick the uncharged heavy attack is, or even the charged heavy attack is, you can use it on almost every single opening, and I wouldn't even bother really using the light attacks unless you had a really small opening. But the major part of this build is going to be using Palm Blast. This weapon skill for only 14 FP does do this cool punching attack, but when fully charged, it turns this punching attack into like a larger AoE that actually can hit at a further distance and do over 30 stance damage. Now, it is going to be a longer animation, but it actually does have the most insane hyper armor. In most cases, you just won't be able to get staggered out of it, and it can make for one of the more fun and easier types of skills to use. So to build around this, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon. Both of these things are going to help enhance the damage of the skill. We also are going to have the Millicent's Prosthesis, which is +5 to your Dexterity stat, and it does give you more damage with successive attacks. We can pair it alongside the Thorny Cracked tier, which does the same thing but to up to 20% more damage. Now, these multi-hit items are going to pair very nicely with the heavy attacks because they do a nice little like 1-2 punch. So it's going to help build them up pretty quickly. You can even just use the light attacks to help proc the buffs as well. Now, if you do see yourself just spamming more of the weapon skill, you could potentially go with the Blade of Mercy instead. But as for the last talisman slots, we have the Axe Talisman, which is just 10% more damage to your charged heavy attacks, because the entire gameplay loop is just spamming charged heavy attacks. And against more complex combos that you're kind of struggling to dodge, you could just use Palm Blast, or against smaller enemies, you could just use Palm Blast because it does knock them to the ground. And as they're standing back up again, you could just use a charged heavy attack. And not only are you going to poise break pretty quickly, but it's just going to stun lock them too. Now, once again, for every single build, I always recommend just going into 15 Faith, because you can use things like Flame Grant Me Strength, Bestial Vitality, some damage negation spells. You could also use Pest Threads as a damaging option. The Frenzied Flame Seal is like the only one that can somewhat scale well with Dexterity. So you can just have this equipped. It doesn't have any requirements and it doesn't weigh anything either. But as always, we are going to have the Rakshasa set equipped as well. Every single piece is 2% damage, and the Blood Sucking Cracked tier, which is 20% more damage for the next 3 minutes, but it does make you take roughly 1% health per second. So if this is a big deal for you, you can just put on the Spiked Cracked tier instead, because that just results in 15% more charge attack damage. And just like for all types of Dexterity builds, just have a dagger in your back pocket infused with Golden Vow. The LEDA'S sword is a really solid Dexterity-based weapon in this game. Now, it actually does get a bit of a Faith scaling, but it's only a D scaling in Faith, so I'd hardly really classify it as such. So in building around it, I'm just going to have 26 Faith and just put the rest of the points into Dexterity. Now, this weapon is a light greatsword, of which their movesets are just incredibly fun to use. Their true power comes in the form of their combo attacks. I always like to lead off with a jumping heavy attack or a running heavy attack, or just a regular heavy, as it does do a nice little double swipe that it can do it pretty quickly, and you can just combo in the light attacks just seamlessly afterwards, and it can just result in a quick 3-hit combo, which is obviously going to pair nicely alongside the multi-hit items. So we're going to have the Millicent's Prosthesis and the Thorny Cracked tier on, because I think these weapons just pair so well alongside these items. Their guard counters also do work the exact same way as this nice little high damaging double swiping attack. And this double swipe can also just combo into the light attack too. So being that these light greatswords have such a good guard counter, obviously that means we're going to have the deflect tier, as that does result in us not taking much damage or any types of stamina damage when blocking at the correct time. And it can result from between 40 to 80% more guard counter damage depending on how many times you block or deflect before actually guard countering. We can also pair it alongside the Curved Sword Talisman and the Two-Handed Sword Talisman to just further enhance the guard counter damage. And this Two-Handed Sword Talisman is going to boost the damage of all attacks except for the skill and critical attack when we just do have the weapon two-handed. Now, being that we're going to spam a lot of heavy attacks and guard counters, we're going to be doing really high amounts of stance damage and getting a lot of critical attacks off. So we do have the Blade of Mercy also. This is 20% more damage for the next 20 seconds after every single critical attack. And we're going to be doing a lot of them. So against almost every single boss, it's just going to result in 20% more damage throughout an entire boss fight. Now, you will notice that I do not have the Shard of Alexander equipped, and that is because that the skill of this weapon does not actually work with the Shard of Alexander, which is still perfectly fine because the skill is not going to be our primary option. We're just going to use it as like a nice quick projectile. The reason why I love this weapon so much is because any single time that an enemy just gets further away from you, you can just click the button instantly and it's going to result in like a nice damaging attack that just tracks right towards them, and it forces the enemy to just come back closer towards you so you can actually go ahead and fight with your amazing combo and your deflecting types of attacks. And I think this entire playstyle just makes for such an enjoyable experience, as there's such little downtime in the fights and the entire combat just flows so nicely with a weapon like this. But yeah, once again, the skill is not going to be doing amazing damage. It's just there for like utility and to make sure like enemies don't regenerate their stance meter. Now, as I did mention, we are going to have 26 Faith. Now, the reason we have 26 is so we can use Golden Vow and Pest Thread Spears. We're going to have the Frenzied Flame Seal equipped as well, because at this level, the Frenzied Flame Seal is going to be the highest damaging one. And we're only going to use Pest Thread Spears against those larger bosses. Any single time you go up against a dragon, you can just go ahead and spam Pest Thread Spears, and they can just get destroyed that way. Because one thing that guard countering builds don't really do that well against is against these really large bosses. And also alongside Golden Vow, we're going to have Flame Grant Me Strength and Blessings Boon just for some more health regen. And once again, for the armor set, you can go any which way. It doesn't really matter that much. But I am going to have some pieces of the Rakshasa set, as every single piece is 2% more damage. And I do have the LEDA'S chest piece on as well, as this is going to result in 10% more damage to your running and rolling attacks. If you see yourself using more jumping attacks, then it's put on the Gravebird chest piece. So if you don't really care much about your fashion, this whole setup of the armor is probably the most optimal way. I consider the Sword of Knights to be one of the more powerful katanas in this game. It's not going to get the highest amount of damage, as it does only get a B scaling and dexterity, does get split magic damage and cannot be infused. But its weapon skill, Witching Hour Slash, is actually really good. For 21 FP, you do this nice 3-hit swing that can do roughly 130 bleed build-up, 14 stance damage, and it can stun lock those enemies like Knights and Omens, which typically like a regular katana moveset cannot do. But when you do have it fully charged, it actually does lunge further, have a larger hitbox, obviously do a bunch more damage, and do roughly twice as much stance damage. Now, some people don't like using it because the skill does take a long time to charge up and you don't get any hyper armor, but I think the most underrated part about this skill is going to be how far that it actually can lunge. If you have correct positioning and spacing, this thing can just be extremely deadly. You can actually end up charging up the skill while the enemy's in the middle of a combo, and if you time it correctly, you can just like lunge in towards the enemy right as they finish and hit him with a high damaging attack. It can be one of the more satisfying types of skills if you do use it correctly, and the skill does get very nice tracking as well. So it's not going to be like that hard to aim either. But to build around it, obviously the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon to further enhance the skill damage, Millicent's Prosthesis and the Thorny Cracked tier, which is going to result in more damage with successive attacks. And we're going to have the White Mask alongside the Lord of Blood Exaltation. Every single time we proc bleed on a nearby enemy, it is going to result in a bunch more damage for the next 20 seconds. Now, as you might have noticed in the gameplay, we do have the Arnsbach Longbow equipped as well. Every single time that you make a build, I just recommend having a projectile option. And with Dexterity builds, being that you don't really have much access to spells, bows are probably going to be your next best thing. And the Arnsbach Longbow is extremely powerful because it is a medium bow with the same moveset as a light bow, so it does get the jumping and landing attacks. But its weapon skill, Fan Shot, does shoot out 8 arrows at once, and it can make it do very respectable damage and help proc status effects really quickly. So you can use the Cold Bone arrows and just proc Frost at the beginning of a boss fight and just debuff enemies that way. And as always, every single build I recommend is going into a little bit of Faith just to utilize some buffs like Bestial Vitality, damage negation spells, or Flame Grant Me Strength, which, yes, this weapon does get a bit of magic damage, but it is mainly physical, so Flame Grant Me Strength is still going to help you out. And once again, just having some pieces of the Rakshasa set equipped and the Blood Sucking tier, I just like to use these for like every single build because it just results in so much more damage. Now, if you were noticing that you were dying to the Blood Sucking tier, you could just replace this with the Dexterity tier, a Damage Negation tier, or something for stamina regeneration. Anyway, that is that now done. The next video will be basically the exact same thing, but just for strength. Just want to cover 5 more strength weapons in the DLC and just make builds around them. So if you have anything in mind that you do want to see, just let me know down in the comments below. And definitely do like and subscribe for that. But yeah, catch you guys around. See ya.